I never thought a single smile could make my pulse race, but when my friend's mom teased, "You're blushing already?" How sweet, I realized this evening wouldn't be ordinary. I wasn't expecting anything special that evening. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just dropping by my friend Daniel's house to borrow a book for a project. The kind of errand you rush through without much thought. But as I stepped into the warm glow of their entryway, the air smelled faintly of jasmine and baked bread, and for some reason, I felt myself slow down. She appeared from the kitchen with a dish towel in one hand and an easy, self-assured smile that caught me a little off guard. Her name was Claire, Daniel's mom. 43, maybe 44. Dark hair swept casually over her shoulder, the kind of natural poise that didn't need effort to feel graceful. There was a softness in her features, but also a certain brightness in her eyes that made you feel seen the moment they met yours. "Ah, you must be Alex," she said, her voice carrying that warm, slightly teasing lilt that makes you straighten without knowing why. "Daniel mentioned you might stop by." Before I could answer, she was already offering me a glass of water, her fingers brushing mine briefly as I accepted it. It wasn't a deliberate touch, just one of those fleeting, ordinary gestures, yet it sent a quiet spark across my skin. Maybe it was the contrast, her hand, faintly cool from the kitchen, against my own slightly clammy from the evening air. "Thank you," I managed, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed a trace of nervousness I didn't know was there. She caught it instantly, or maybe she always noticed these things, because her smile tilted just a little, amused. "You're blushing already? How sweet." The words landed like a playful nudge, not unkind, just enough to make my pulse skip. I laughed awkwardly and rubbed the back of my neck. "It's, warmer in here than I expected." Her eyes lingered a second too long, like she knew that wasn't the reason. Then, with a graceful turn, she gestured toward the living room. "Daniel's upstairs, but he won't be long. Make yourself at home." I followed her, noticing the quiet order of the house, books neatly stacked on the coffee table, a faint piano tune playing somewhere in the background. She moved with a kind of unhurried confidence, like every step was deliberate yet light, and for a reason I couldn't name, I found myself watching the way her hair caught the warm lamplight as she passed. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. She was my friend's mom, kind, polite, a little teasing. That's all. But the remark stayed with me, like the echo of a note that refuses to fade. By the time Daniel finally came down the stairs, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing at all. Daniel had gone upstairs to grab the book, leaving me in the kitchen with her. Claire moved around the space with an ease that made it feel less like a room and more like a warm pocket of her presence, soft light under the cabinets, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint aroma of something sweet baking in the oven. "You're in your final year, aren't you?" she asked, reaching into the cupboard for 2 cups. Her tone wasn't just polite curiosity, it was engaged, genuinely interested. "Yeah," I said, leaning lightly against the counter. "Feels like it's going by faster than I expected." She glanced over her shoulder, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Time does that when you're not looking. 1 minute it's all ahead of you, and then suddenly you're looking back, wondering where it went." I nodded, not entirely sure why her words carried more weight than a casual remark should. There was something in her voice, not sadness, exactly, but a trace of wistfulness. As she set the cups down, her bracelets shifted with a soft metallic whisper. She reached for the sugar jar, and as she passed it to me, her fingers brushed the back of my hand, a small, unthinking contact, cool and smooth against my skin. It was nothing, really. A fraction of a second. But in the silence that followed, I realized I was hyper-aware of it. The oven beeped softly, breaking the moment. She slipped on an oven mitt and bent slightly to check on the tray inside. The warm air rolled out, carrying a scent of cinnamon that wrapped around us both. I watched the way a strand of her hair slid forward as she leaned in, catching the golden light. "You bake often?" I asked, just to keep the air from growing too still. "Whenever I need the house to feel like home," she said with a small laugh, sliding the tray onto the counter. Daniel doesn't usually mind being my taste tester. The laugh wasn't loud, more like the kind that stayed close to her lips, but it made me look at her differently for a moment. Not as someone older or out of reach, but as someone with warmth tucked quietly behind her composed exterior. Our eyes met again, just briefly. There wasn't anything said, but the pause lingered, that moment where a conversation feels like it's waiting to tilt one way or another. Then Daniel's footsteps thudded down the stairs, breaking whatever thread had formed between us. She straightened, slipping the mitt off, and turned her attention toward the hallway as if nothing had happened. "Cookies are ready if either of you want one," she said lightly. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how still I'd been standing, how carefully I'd been listening to the sound of her bracelets and the rise and fall of her voice. It was nothing. Just a kitchen. Just a moment. But already, it felt like I'd noticed more in 10 minutes than I had in weeks elsewhere. Later that evening, Daniel's phone rang. Something about a neighbor needing help with his car. He grabbed his jacket, muttered a quick, "I'll be 10 minutes," and was gone before I could suggest I'd tag along. The door clicked shut, and just like that, the house seemed to exhale, quieter, stiller. Claire was in the living room, rearranging a few cushions on the sofa, when I stepped in. The warm lamplight painted her features in softer shades, catching on the gold threads of her sweater. A half-empty mug of tea rested on the coffee table, steam curling faintly. "You don't mind me keeping you company, do you?" I asked, hovering by the doorway. She looked up, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Why would I? It's nice to have someone actually talk to me while Daniel is running around." She gestured toward the couch. "Sit." I sat, leaving a polite gap between us, the kind of distance you'd instinctively keep. We started talking, first about the book I came for, then somehow about music, about the places she liked to visit when she had time to herself. Her voice had a quiet rhythm, the kind that didn't demand attention but invited it. Every now and then, I found my gaze drifting to her hands as she spoke, slender, steady, resting on her knee. At one point, she reached for her mug, and the edge of her knee brushed mine, a whisper of contact that lingered longer than it should have. Neither of us shifted away immediately. "You know," she said, turning her mug slowly between her palms, "I forget how refreshing it is to talk to someone your age. Not because you're younger, but because you still look ahead more than behind." I smiled, unsure whether that was meant as a compliment or a confession. "And you? Do you look back more?" She chuckled softly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes. But I try not to live there." The room felt wrapped in small sounds, the hum of the distant TV from another room, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, the soft scrape of her mug against the table. It wasn't silence, exactly. More like the kind of quiet that draws you in rather than shuts you out. She laughed at something I said about my first disastrous attempt at cooking, and without thinking, reached over and lightly tapped my hand with her fingertips. Just a tap, but her touch was cool and delicate, leaving a trace of warmth as it faded. My chest felt oddly full for a moment, like the air had thickened just slightly. Neither of us said anything about it. We didn't need to. When Daniel returned, stomping the cold out of his shoes, we both shifted slightly, like two people gently stepping back from a line they hadn't meant to draw. The night had deepened into that quiet hour where the world feels softer. Daniel was upstairs again, headphones on, lost in his own world, and I found myself drifting toward the balcony. The door was slightly ajar, letting in a cool breath of late winter air. Claire was already there, leaning lightly on the railing, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She turned when she heard me, her breath forming a faint mist in the cold. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Didn't even try. Feels nice out here." The street was still, a few distant lamps flickering. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped. The night had that hollow, open sound to it, like everything was waiting for something to happen. She pulled the shawl a little tighter. "Sometimes I stand out here just to clear my head," she said. "It's easy to forget how quiet life can be when you let it." I stepped closer, resting my hands on the railing beside hers, not too close, but close enough to share the cool air. "Do you miss the noise?" I asked. She gave a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes. But it's complicated, isn't it? The noise keeps you busy, but it doesn't always mean you're not alone." That word, alone, lingered between us. It wasn't heavy, but it felt true. I glanced at her, and for the first time that night, the confidence I'd seen in her earlier seemed to soften. There was a quiet vulnerability in the way she looked out over the street, like she wasn't afraid of being seen, just not used to it. Without thinking, I shrugged off my jacket. "Here," I said gently. "You'll catch a chill." She hesitated, a half-smile tugging at her lips, then turned slightly so I could drape it over her shoulders. As my hands brushed against her upper arms, I felt the faint rise of goosebumps beneath the fabric, her warmth meeting the chill of my palms. It was the briefest contact, but it sent a soft, unexpected shiver through me too. "Thank you," she murmured. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," I replied before I could stop myself. The balcony light flickered once, a soft, almost comic reminder of how still we had been standing. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes carrying that same quiet brightness from before, but now touched with something more reflective. "I forget sometimes," she said slowly, "that the world isn't only behind me. There's still a lot ahead, if I let it be." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. So I didn't. We just stood there, sharing the cold night air, the faint hum of the city far below, and a jacket that suddenly felt like more than fabric. Then Daniel's voice called faintly from inside, breaking the spell. She smiled, a soft, knowing thing, and stepped back toward the door. "Come on," she said quietly. "Before we both freeze." The house had fallen into one of those late-night silences where even the walls seemed to rest. Daniel had long gone to bed, a faint bass from his headphones leaking through the ceiling above. I stayed behind in the living room, flipping through the book I came for, though I couldn't have said what I was reading. My focus kept drifting. Claire returned with 2 mugs of tea, her steps soft against the rug. "Couldn't let you stay awake without something warm," she said with a quiet smile, placing one beside me. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile. "Thanks," I murmured. "You really didn't have to." She sank onto the couch beside me, not close enough to be bold, but near enough that the cushion shifted under her weight. There was that faint brush of space again, like a thread being pulled tighter between us without either of us naming it. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, the recipe she'd been experimenting with, a book I'd been trying to finish, the way winter always felt longer than it really was. Her laugh came easier now, lower and more unguarded, as though the late hour allowed her to let something slip past the surface. At one point, I made a clumsy joke about my tea-making skills being dangerously below average, and she laughed, shaking her head. Then, without warning, she reached out and laid her hand over mine, warm, light, her thumb resting just at the edge of my knuckle. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I made this one," she said softly. The contact was brief but deliberate enough to register, the soft weight of her palm, the faint press of her fingers, the warmth that seemed to bloom out from that single point of touch. My heart picked up in the smallest, almost imperceptible way. I didn't pull back. Neither did she. "I'm glad you stayed a little longer tonight," she added after a moment, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper meant for no one else. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I noticed the slight tiredness in her eyes, the fine line at the corner of her mouth that deepened when she smiled, the way her hair fell slightly out of place, making her seem less polished, more real. The urge to say something sat heavy in my chest. But words felt too blunt for the quiet between us, so I simply nodded, fingers shifting faintly beneath hers as though to answer in the smallest language possible. Then, just as naturally as it had happened, she lifted her hand, wrapping it around her mug again. The warmth she left behind felt almost louder than the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. "Tea's getting cold," she said lightly, as if nothing had passed. But something had. We both knew it. The clock had slipped past midnight by the time I finally stood to leave. My jacket was already draped over my arm, the same one she'd worn on the balcony earlier. It still held a trace of her perfume, faint but unmistakable. Daniel had long since disappeared into sleep, and the house felt suspended in that fragile space between night and morning. Claire followed me to the front door. Her steps were unhurried, soft against the hardwood, and there was something in the quiet that felt almost expectant, though neither of us said it aloud. "You're sure you don't want to stay a bit longer?" she asked, half smiling, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. I shook my head with a small laugh. "If I stay any longer, I might forget I was only here for a book." Her lips curved at that, the corners lifting in a way that was both amused and something else. The kind of look that lingers, the kind that doesn't belong entirely to politeness. "Alex," she said after a pause, her voice lowering just enough that I had to look at her fully. "You've been kind tonight. Not everyone notices when someone needs company." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't kindness, that being here, talking with her, had felt natural, like slipping into a quiet current I didn't know I'd been waiting for. But the words felt too heavy, too close to a truth neither of us could name. Her fingers rose to adjust the scarf at my collar, a small, practiced gesture, but as they brushed the side of my neck, a quiet warmth settled there, fleeting but unforgettable. "Rare these days," she murmured. "People who just listen." I swallowed, feeling the cold draft seeping in through the door, the rain-slicked scent of the street outside, the steady thrum of my own heartbeat. "You deserve that," I said finally, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. For a breath, we simply stood there, her hand falling back to her side, mine clutching the book I'd almost forgotten about. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was charged, like the moment before a string is plucked. I could have said more. I could have crossed that invisible step between honesty and admission. But something, respect, timing, fear, held me back. She smiled then, soft and knowing, the kind of smile that acknowledges a truth without demanding it be spoken. "Good night, Alex," she whispered. I stepped into the cold, the door closing gently behind me. My breath hung in the air, and with it, the feeling that something had just shifted, not declared, not acted upon, but undeniably there. And as I walked away, the warmth of her fingers at my collar lingered far longer than the chill on my cheeks did. A few days passed before I found myself back at Daniel's house. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where the winter sun spills through the windows just enough to make the dust in the air look like slow-falling snow. I'd come by to return the book, and maybe, if I was honest with myself, to see if that quiet thread from a few nights ago was still there. Daniel greeted me at the door, loud as ever, talking about a game he wanted to show me. His voice filled the house in that familiar way, but underneath it, I caught a softer sound, the kettle in the kitchen, a chair shifting. She was here. Claire appeared with a tray of tea, her hair tied back this time, sleeves pushed to her elbows. The same warm composure, but lighter somehow, like the late-night hush had been replaced with daylight ease. Her eyes flicked to mine for just a second longer than they needed to. "Back again," she said, teasing gently. "That book must have been worth the trouble." I smiled. "I think it was the company more than the book." She set the tray down without answering, but a faint curve touched her lips, the kind that said she'd heard more than the words. Daniel was already setting up the game in the living room, completely unaware of the undercurrent that seemed to ripple quietly between his mother and me. We all sat together, the afternoon slipping by in comfortable fragments, laughter over something ridiculous on the screen, the clink of cups being refilled, the occasional soft brush of her hand as she passed me the teapot. Each touch was casual, ordinary even, but carried that same warmth I remembered from before, like an echo left behind. At one point, while Daniel was briefly out of the room fetching something, she leaned slightly closer. "Did you finish it?" she asked, nodding toward the book. "I did," I said. "And I think I might borrow another, if that's allowed." "Of course," she replied, her tone low enough that it felt almost like a secret. "There's always more to discover." For a moment, the air between us felt like it had in the quiet of that night, not heavy, not rushed, just aware. But this time, it was framed by daylight, by the sound of footsteps returning, by a shared understanding that some connections don't need to be forced to be real. As I left later, the sun just beginning to dip, she walked me to the door again. No whispered confessions, no stolen words. Just a small smile, a hand brushing lightly against mine as she handed me a new book. "Take your time with this one," she said. "Good things aren't meant to be rushed." I stepped out into the cool air with a strange, quiet certainty. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, it didn't need to be hurried. Some stories didn't start with declarations. Some began with a smile, a cup of tea, and a moment that refused to fade.